Yeah, thank you to Grant, and thank you also to the University of Edinburgh. It's a real pleasure to be here again, and also to help to cement the partnership that's building between our two departments and our two universities. I'm not going to talk about other work unless you have questions at the end, but I just wanted to mention that the multiculturalism project that Grant talked about is probably going to be a first in sports studies, in that it's a citizen science project, and so we're really reaching out to the community to build a database around multicultural games, sports, physical activities. So there's a couple of there's a little bit of symbolism I need to talk about at the beginning here. You'll notice the arrow on my slides, as part of the slide design. I kind of chose this. It kind of gives you a bit of it's a biological symbol for masculinity. That's given the direction of the arrow. And I thought, as a pro-feminist paper, I would slip that little bit of symbology in there. And the other piece is the I've been a powerful critic of the audit culture that's been happening in universities, and not powerful in a political sense, but powerful in my hate of the audit culture. And so I almost deliberately use the term audit rather than survey, that kind of thing, just to show that it's not audits themselves that are bad, it's the particular ways that they can be used. And so this is my attempt at an audit. I just wanted to give a little context for it to begin with in terms of the Center for Sport Policy Studies. And these equity issues are one of the tasks that we've undertaken at the center. And the report cards that we knew about from other places and other organizations tended to be really very often quite subjective, and probably the main one in Canada has been the Active Healthy Kids report card, which comes out, Active Healthy Kids Canada report card every year, and it gets a lot of publicity in Canada, but it's based on a large database, and it ends up giving a subjective A, B, C, or D, plus or minus marks to the ability of various organizations to increase children's participation in sport and physical activity. So I felt it was kind of soft science, and if we wanted to make a real policy intervention, we needed some really hard data, robust data, and we also didn't want to use the data to stigmatize sport organizations, that you're sexist, you're racist, you're not doing it. We wanted to pick on organizations that already had equity policies, but they weren't implementing them, they weren't acting on them, they weren't realizing them, so the reports were basically to assist with that. As an important tool for realizing their policy, because very often they haven't done their own audit. They haven't seen where they're at in terms of their policies, and we were in an independent position to provide data. And this gets into this idea of, very often if they would contract out research on this, the contract sometimes has embargo details in it, or not releasing the data, particularly if it makes the organization look bad. So we wanted to do this independent of the organizations, so that we would have the possibility of releasing the data and saying to the organization, you really need to do some work on this. So. And we wanted to do them systematically as well, so that we could also flag up change. If, 2 years later they've improved, we wanted to be able to say that. If they're still the same, we wanted to be able to say that. So that's the kind of background on this. The two models for our analyses were two American models. One is Acosta and Carpenter's. They've been doing their reports on annually for well over 30 years now of women's leadership in university sports in the United States. And they count the number of women coaches, the number of women athletic directors, and they were the ones that flagged up that after Title IX in the United States, which mandated funding equity for American university sports, it resulted in massive job loss for women. All of a sudden there were scholarships for women athletes. It became a legitimate career for male coaches, and so women's athletic departments got merged into men's athletic departments, and there was huge job loss, and they flagged that up, and I've been looking at the slow comeback of women's coaching positions and women's administrative positions in university athletics. And the other one was Richard Lapchick's Racial and Gender Equity Report Cards in the United States, and those also come out annually. They also look at professional sports, but also university sports, and they look at leadership, they look at participation, they look at graduation rates of white and black athletes in the United States. So they're fairly comprehensive, but I've found out recently they're built on fairly soft data, and the soft data are self-reported by the universities, and particularly in terms of race. American universities collect racial data, but they collect it in a very specific way, that a student has to self-identify on a limited list of racial categories, and that self-identification forms the basis for these racial and gender equity report cards. And if at the end I may talk about a racial equity study that we're planning, but we're planning to do it in a more rigorous way. So those were the basis, and we started out a few years ago when we finally got around to doing these with looking at Canadian inter-university sport. And we looked at the gender of student athletes, and we made the assumption, legitimate assumption, that because sport is segregated by gender, that if you played a woman's sport, that you were a woman, if you played a man's sport, you're a man, and you know, if you're on the men's team, you're a man. And so we worked from that assumption for the athletes. For the coaches, we thought about using photographs of you know, coaches and administrators. We thought about using photographs and names as a possible way to go about it, and then we decided that if we were really going to be rigorous on this, that we would just phone to confirm. And so we telephoned all 50 universities and just to say, you know, can you confirm, you know, that Pat Smith is a woman or a man, you know, and so we check it that way, just to without making any assumptions, and you know, clearly there could possibly be some transitioning individuals who are involved, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't making any assumptions about that. So and then we compare those demographics with the student body. So we find that on average across Canada, 44% of the inter-university athletes are female, but females constitute about 57% of the student body at Canadian universities. So they're not proportionately represented in any way. I mean, it's by being below 50%, it's not proportional anyway, but in terms of what the student body looks like, women are significantly underrepresented. And then at the coaching level, just massive differences, with most women's sports being coached by men. And I think the administrative position, certainly the head, the athletic director position, that's moved recently up to about 20% of the universities have a woman as an athletic director who administers both men's and women's athletics. So that's it's certainly improved, but it's not it's not equitable by any means. So we're working on our third report now. We made these biannual, and the first one freaked out the CIS, Canadian Inter-University Sport, and it freaked them out so much that they came up with a set of speaking notes for every coach and athletic director in Canada, because they thought the media was going to be all over this. It wasn't completely over it, but it did make them sit up in terms of the fact that they were not attending to their own gender equity policy. And scholarship money in Canada for athletes is supposed to be equally shared between men and women according to the CIS regulations, and it's not. It's as disproportionate as the actual positions. And they know this is coming now. We're on the third one. They've actually revived their equity committee as a consequence of this, but we haven't heard of any changes that have occurred. So when we realized that when you use rigorous data, people can't come back at you. They can't tell you that you've been spinning this in any way. There's no political slant in this. This is just head counting, and it's rigorous head counting. And so we realized that we probably should do some more, and probably the major games was the second project we've started. There's 2 reports out on Commonwealth Games, one on Glasgow and one on historically gender in the Commonwealth Games, and we're shifting to. We're going to add Paralympic and para sports to the future gender audits, but it's an obvious one to deal with because sport is segregated by gender. And it's one of the few areas of life that's still segregated by gender, certainly in organizational life. Maybe the church, some churches are segregated, but it's not many areas of life left that are completely segregated by gender in this way. So in that sense, there's a kind of responsibility to, the only justification for it is if they're separate but equal, and clearly they're not. So, and the real trigger for us was the triumphalism that occurred after the London Olympics, or during the London Olympics in terms of gender equality. And the last time that happened was 1996. They called the Atlanta Olympics the Women's Olympics, and then they were beginning to use that again with the 2012 Olympics. So the IOC has been committed to gender equality since 1994, after years and years of lobbying by international women's sport organizations to move towards equality. They finally, that was still Samaranch, right? Yeah, anyway, he finally bowed to it. And they were beginning to realize that more than 50% of their international audience for Olympic Games was women, and so they decided that they needed to have some equality principles in place, and they actually put it into the Olympic Charter in 1994, where the role of the IOC is to act against discrimination, and a specific article on the promotion and equality of women within the Olympic movement. And so that was the fundamental basis. So what we asked, our skepticism following the London Olympics, and there was a lot to celebrate. For the first time, no country there deliberately excluded women. Women athletes from their team. It was the highest percentage of women athletes at any summer games existed in London, and I'm trying to think what that. Anyway, there were 3 major firsts for the London Olympics, and so our skeptical selves said, "What's left to do? Is this the end of history for women in sport and Olympic sports, or do we really, what actually is left to do to achieve equity?" And we analyzed men's and women's events and sports at London 2012, and then just this year we finished the Sochi report earlier this year. And we had two main purposes. One was to identify gender differences in the structure of the events, that is, number of men, number of women, were there quotas, why were we finding this 44% women, 56% men kind of difference at the Olympics, and certainly the number of events. And then what do these messages, what do these tell us? Why are there so many events that still have rule differences between the men's and women's competition? And I think we've done the first real systematic accounting of what the rules differences are between men's and women's sports. And obviously they send out important messages that women's sports are different, and in many ways the message is that they're not as important as, the men's is the standard and the women's is, something else there. So what we decided to do was we saw 1994 was the hallmark date, when the IOC decided to go for gender equality. So what's happened in the 18 to 20 years since 1994, and what happened in the previous 20 years, and was there really an effect from announcing and declaring, within the Olympic Charter that they would work towards Olympic equality. And certainly what we've seen over the 40 years is the women have moved from about 20% of participants at the Montreal Olympics and the Innsbruck Olympics in 1976, and that's 1 in 5. They've moved up to approximately 2 in 5 participants at the Olympics now, slightly over 2 in 5 participants in 2012 and 2014, the last two data points we have. The proportion of medal events for women has also increased from 1 in 5, approximately 1 in 5 to approximately 2 in 5. So there's almost 25% of the medal events in Montreal, and it was 45% of the medal events in London. So you can still see that 136 out of 302, there were still 30 more opportunities for men to win a medal than women at the Women's Olympics in London. So, then they've moved up from Innsbruck. There's always been a higher proportion of women's events at the Winter Olympics, so the increase has been much smaller for the Winter Olympics, from 40.5% to 46%. But the rate of growth didn't change as a consequence of 1994. We looked at 1994 specifically, the Olympics around 1994, and there were about 30% of the participants, both summer and winter, were women. And so for the years before, it increased 10%, and then the years since, it's increased 10%. So there wasn't a great change. And 20 years after the Paris Congress, almost 60% of the athletes at the Winter Olympics are still men, and over 55% of the athletes at Summer Olympics are still men. And you can see that there was a bump. This is just another summary of that data, but there was a bump, if you look at the bottom of the screen there, right after the Paris Congress, the Olympics that were held right after the Paris Congress in 1994, so Atlanta in 1996, the number of women participants, women's events increased over 5%, and at Nagano in 1998, it was increased over 6% from the previous Olympics. But then it slipped right back to between 1% and 2% increase per year. And for Sochi this year, the Summer Olympics has increased in terms of women's participation steadily in small increments every year certainly since 1976 and even before then. The Winter Olympics has had a couple of setbacks. Calgary, shamefully, there were fewer women in Calgary than there had been at the previous Summer Olympics. Winter Olympics, I should say, and there were fewer women in Sochi proportionately than there had been in Vancouver. So it shifted from 40.7% in Vancouver to 44.4% in Sochi. So it was a small setback in that progress towards equality. So, how do we account for the failure to achieve equality now that you have policy in place? It's been in place for 20 years. Why haven't you achieved it? And it seems there are three interconnected reasons why policy hasn't been achieved. And that is the way new women's events have been added to the Olympic Games, the remaining sport-by-sport, event-by-event gender quotas that still exist, and concerns about gigantism, which is an Olympic fear that only gets applied to athletes. So let's see how these interact. So adding women's events. Under the new equity policies, if you added a men's event to the Olympics, you also had to add a women's event. And so we've seen, and so men are progressing just in the same way women are progressing. So when they added mountain biking, it was both men's and women's mountain biking, beach volleyball, men's and women's, curling, men's and women's, snowboarding, men's and women's, So all of these events that have been added since 1994 are all been added on an equal basis, the men and the women. Rio will add golf and rugby sevens as two new sports, but they're added equally. So there's a men's event and a women's event. So that's been the policy which makes it difficult to rectify previous inequalities that existed. A few women's events have been added, specifically as a makeup. Ski jumping, ice hockey in 1998, pole vault has been added, and you can think of some others, So some women's events have been added to match up with a men's event, very often after significant lobbying, sometimes even after lawsuits. There was a lawsuit in Vancouver over ski jumping that to have men's ski jumping and no women's ski jumping was a complete violation of Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and so it was illegal in Canada, and the judge, the suit brought by the women ski jumpers said, yeah, it was illegal in Canada, but this is an international organization and we can't do anything about it. But the pressure was enough that they added one ski jumping event in Sochi. And FIS, is the usual bunch of old dinosaurs, that working with the ski federation. So despite the fact there are two women-only sports events at Summer Olympics, synchronized swimming and rhythmic gymnastics, there's still 30 more events and opportunities to win a medal for men, and on our means of counting, 7.5 more events for men at the Winter Olympics. And how do we get 7.5 more events? Okay, let me explain this. There are two ways of counting mixed gender events, like mixed doubles tennis, that kind of thing. One, you could count it as both a men's event and a women's event, or you can count it as 0.5 for men, 0.5 for women, and then you keep the same number of events. So you're not violating the actual total number of events. And that's what we use, is the 0.5 counting. And so that's how there is an additional complication at Sochi that I'll get to. So let's look at quotas. Sports stipulating a lower quota for women. For example, football is 16 men's teams and 12 women's teams in the football soccer tournaments at the Olympics. Water polo and ice hockey both have 12 men's teams and 8 women's teams in their tournaments. And in ice hockey, the men's per team quota is higher. So men's teams are allowed to dress and bring 25 athletes. Women are only allowed to dress and bring 21 athletes per team. So those quotas are sometimes related to the number of events, but not quite specifically. So boxing, oh yeah, this was the third edition in London. Women were in, that was the last event that had been men only, and in the Summer Olympics. And so they added 3 boxing events for women and dropped 1 weight category for men so men went from 11 events to 10 events to accommodate the three women's events that they added. So 250 men over 10 events means there's 25 competitors per event, approximately. And for the women, 36 women were in boxing, so it's 12 per event in boxing. And so rowing, you can see the quota there, 350 men and 197 women is the total. There are a couple more rowing events for men than women, but not that much. Luge is 78 men, 28 women, and you can go through, the reports and just see what the quotas are. And the quotas don't change very much, and what you have to recognize, and we did a lot of research on this to see where these quotas came from, they come from the federations, but they have to be approved by the IOC 2 years before every Olympics. So the IOC has been signing off on this gender inequality on a routine basis. And gigantism has, I think this first became a concern in '92 in Barcelona, and there were approximately 10,500 athletes at the Summer Olympics at that time, and the IOC pretty much decided to freeze it at that. It's usually been between 10,500 and 11,000 athletes at each Summer Olympics. So the athletes are not causing the gigantism. What's causing the gigantism is the media personnel, more than 20,000 at each Summer Olympics, almost 25,000 in London, and the growth in the number of accredited persons, people who get to wear a badge and get into facilities. And this is the corporate sponsors. This is the Olympic family, which includes pretty much anybody they want to include. It's, and this is huge. And this has gone from 196,000 in Sydney to the reports we heard for London was 510,000 accredited persons at London. So that's the gigantism. It's got nothing to do with the athletes, and yet the athletes are being frozen at a particular level while they've let everything else just get out of hand. So it's quite phenomenal. So Agenda 2020, which is the new reform agenda for the Olympic Games, addresses this, but they've kept the summer cap on athletes, and they've permitted a small amount of growth in the Winter Olympics to a maximum of 2,900 athletes. And they've also put caps on the number of support personnel, like trainers, coaches, those kind of people who can be there and who are permitted to be in the Olympic Village, I suppose, as well, for the most part. So that's recommendation 9 out of the Reform Agenda 20+20. And so what these limits do is they pit men against women, whereby equality can now only be achieved by cutting men's events. And we argue that that's completely unreasonable. The athletes are not responsible for the inequality that has crept in. They're not responsible for the gigantism that is there. And so if you're going to achieve equality, add more events, add more women, go to your 50%, which is what the reform agenda also wants. So we argue that organizations that can permit this kind of exponential growth in their events must achieve gender equality goals by adding women athletes and events beyond the arbitrary caps that they've, at least to begin with, and then once they've achieved equality, then they can review the Olympic program in whatever way they like. But they need to achieve the equality in the first place. So this is their gender equality recommendation from Agenda 2020, work to achieve 50%. We like to think that this is from our London Olympics report, where we asked for 50%, and this is the very first time that's appeared in an Olympic document, that they work towards 50%. So stimulate women's participation and involvement by creating more participation opportunities at Olympic Games. But recommendation 9 means that you can't do that without cutting men, okay? So that's where these conflict with each other. And then they also want to encourage the inclusion of mixed gender team events at under Thomas Bach in this reform agenda. And so, you know, this is one example of it. Thomas Bach is encouraging the International Cycling Federation to consider trialing mixed relay events at the Olympic Games. So that, you know, and there are a number of others that are coming in or in place now. So in light of recommendation 9, capping the number of athletes, 50% participation can only be achieved by cutting men's sports and events. And the inclusion of more mixed gender events won't add women athletes proportionately. And we looked at Sochi specifically for this. So just to show you the data on this, they added 3 new mixed gender events at the Sochi Olympics. This was the biathlon mixed relay, luge mixed relay, and they're considering this for speed skating now, and cross-country skiing, I think, a mixed relay, and a number of other sports. And the figure skating team competition was added. So 3 new mixed gender events. The luge likes to call the 2-person luge, and it's listed as an open competition. It can be either men or women. There's never been 2 women or a man and a woman on a 2-person luge. It's always been 2 men, but they like to keep it open. So what they did with the luge mixed relay was 3 men. That's a men's doubles, a men's singles, and a women's singles would form a relay team. So what were the actual opportunities created for athletes as a result of adding these mixed events? 4 athletes, 2 men and 2 women, across the 3 events. That's a total of 168 athletes in these 3 events. So only 4 of the 168 didn't compete in an already existing singles event at those games. And so it doesn't do anything, okay? You know, the mixed events doesn't do anything. Didn't contribute to increasing gender equality at Sochi. And it's difficult to see how they could. And I just want to show you, this is IOC's gender math here. And if you look at the bottom line there, you saw that we counted 45 events for women in Sochi. They count 49 events. And they actually claim that 50% of the events in Sochi were women's events. Now, in one sense, they're not lying here. There were women in 49 events. But really, they weren't 50% because men were also in those additional events, okay? So by counting them as a full event for women, but not a full event for men, there's a sleight of hand that's going on here, you know, and, you know, they can say, you know, that this is, you know, and this is IOC table, and they say that they include mixed gender events, so they're not, you know, but it's sleight of hand, you know, because there are men in all of those additional mixed gender events, and so if you count it the same way, you'd have to increase the total number of events. They don't do that. Okay, so this is the IOC gender math. So that was the first question, and we just show that we're suggesting that equality is plateauing a little around, you know, 40 to 45% is kind of good enough for the federations and the IOC, and it seems to be plateauing. If they're going to keep adding mixed gender events, that's not going to increase anything. And so maybe these data will, help to provoke some additional. I know some women in the Canoe Kayak Federation are using our summer data unmercifully to lobby the International Canoe Kayak Federation, and they've actually got, for the very first time, some women's canoe events added in Brazil. So the data are helping with the lobbying efforts, and certainly the international women's sport groups are certainly using this to lobby for more equality. How are we doing? I'm going to run through the last part of this. So this is the summary of the structure. I just wanted to indicate that we're very conscious that this is a liberal feminist perspective that we're working with here, that this is, that this doesn't take account of intersectionality at all. It doesn't take account of the fact that the majority of women at Olympic Games are white women from high-income countries. So, we're not even dealing with those the more critical feminist approaches. And yet what we're saying is that if you can't get your liberal feminist equality right, how can you even think of embarking onto, the more structural feminist equality positions? So there's no chance of getting there. And very quickly, I just want to talk about the way rules gender competition in various ways. And a lot of the competitions are equal. There's no rules difference between the men's and women's 100 meters swimming or running or track, So, a lot of the sports are really quite identical, but not all of them. And more than 50% of the comparable events have different rules for men and women. And the first and most obvious one is women racing a shorter distance than men. Weight categories and weight restrictions are different for men and women in the weight-sensitive sports. The height, weight, spacing of equipment, size of venue is different in quite a number of sports. And then there are other rules differences where we captured a number of other things. I'll just go through those quite quickly for you. So all track and field except hurdles, and the sprint hurdles event is 110 meters for men and 100 meters for women. And men get to do a 50-kilometer race walk, and women don't. So, all the other events are pretty much the same for men and women. All the other races are pretty much the same for men and women, but those two are different. And yet both men and women run in a 42-kilometer marathon, but women aren't allowed to do a 50-kilometer race walk. So that's one difference. Swimming. Everything's the same in swimming in terms of distance, except there's an 800-meter, the longest event for women is 800 meters, and there's no 800 meters for men, but there's a 1,500 meters event for men. So the same number of races in swimming, but one different here. And again, both men and women swim the 10-kilometer open water swim. So again, that's not really a reasonable difference. So all kinds of difference in rowing, cycling, speed skating. All of the biathlon events, men skate a longer distance than women. 10 out of 12 cross-country skiing events, men ski a longer distance from women. And cycling is one of the more egregious ones in here. And if you look at road cycling, the road race for men is 250 kilometers. For women, it's 140 kilometers. And in the time trial, men bike 44K and women's is 29K. So, there are all kinds of possible reasons for this, but there's a real gendering that is going on here. Weight categories, the combat sports have different weight categories. The newer sports, Taekwondo and Judo, are much closer in terms of weight categories than the older sports, wrestling and boxing. Weightlifting is reasonably close, but women don't have that kind of super heavyweight category in any of those. And sliding sports. There's no reason for this that I can think of, because you're allowed to add extra weight to your sleds to get up to a certain weight. So why can't, you know, the sleds be the same weight? But again, the restrictions are different for men and women. Equipment and venue, field events, you know, all the field events. The javelin smaller, lighter for women, the discus, the shot, the hammer, all different size and weight. Ball size, smaller in water polo for women than for men, but not smaller in basketball or volleyball. Net height is the same for men and women in basketball, but it's lower in volleyball. Women compete in a smaller pool in water polo. And you know how much that costs Olympic organizers to make a smaller pool for women than for men, or, you know, to put in bulkheads to make the pool smaller. Lighter guns in some shooting events, etc., etc. And you can see this in reports, so that goes on and on. And then other differences. The number of sets in the tennis final, you know, men play 5, women play 3. Number of rounds in boxing, women box 4 2-minute rounds, men box 3 3-minute rounds. Duration of the free program in free skating, longer for men than for women. Techniques that may be used. Certain techniques are not permitted to women in wrestling, in the freestyle wrestling. Ice hockey, there's no body checking in women's ice hockey, but there is in men's. And then what may or must be worn is different, whether it's figure skating or many of the skiing events, including ski jumping. But the new sports, the snowboarding, the ski cross, men and women, exactly the same. No restriction on uniform. It's very kind of mod youth kind of uniform, but the restrictions exist in the older ski events. So finally, we're not arguing for complete equality, that if there is an event for men, that there must be an event for women in exactly the same rules. We're not arguing for that. What we're arguing for is some form of equivalence in the number of events and the number of athletes at both Summer and Winter Olympics. We're arguing to resolve the contradictions, you know, why there are, you know, longer races, same race, you know, same race distance in some sports and not in others. We're arguing for an end to the assumptions about the size and capacity of women, the strength, stamina, and endurance of women in comparison to men, which are completely signaled by the rule differences that exist, that are, some are from the 19th century, some are from the earlier 20th century, and the difference between men and women. And we're arguing for expert groups that must include athletes, to explore the remaining rules, differences, and to determine which ones are still warranted. You know, some may be legitimate, reasonable, have everybody's support, but, you know, we need some real data on this. Anthropometric data, biophysical data, and athletes' experiential data. We need, you know, to decide if these kind of gender differences are still warranted and not based in some archaic assumptions about men's and women's size and capacity. So that's where we're at with this. Thank you.
Who funded all this? There's so much work.
We did. Yeah, we funded out of limited funds from the center. The reason we were able to do this, particularly the London Olympics, was just a gift in terms of the Guardian website and the London Organising Committee website. It was a real gift. The hardest part was some of the rule differences were mentioned, the quotas were mentioned in the London Organising Committee website, but to drill down into the kind of finer rule differences, we had to go to the International Federation websites and download the rules for rules of competition, and and we also made it. We put out an open call on a couple of listservs to people to say if there's anything we missed, or the rule differences that you know about. And we got some interesting stuff about gymnastics, about figure skating, that we had missed in the rules. And then we interviewed some judges there's a whole subjective dimension to the freestyle skiing and snowboarding events that we really needed to understand, like judges being at practices and making their own subjective determinations about what is high difficulty trick for women, what's high difficulty trick for men, So while there are no specific rule differences, there are subjective rule differences that we started to find in some of those events as well. So in a sense, it's just time, the interviews we did by phone, for the most part, any that we needed to do. So it's not expensive research to do, but it is time-consuming research to do. And I paid a couple of grad students small stipends to help work on this as well.
So you didn't feel like you were had some funder that might have that you had to pander to or whatever. So.
Exactly, and I think contract research is really difficult when you're a university professor where the data you're supposed to have the data to be able to publish, and a lot of my colleagues, particularly in the medical field, are signing up for contract research where the funder has final say on what gets released and what doesn't, and I think it's absurd to me. This is the last free-thinking institution in the world, as a university, and it's being free-thinking is being limited in some ways.
Peter, thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. Clearly, a lot of work has gone into it, and you've had a 20-minute snapshot there to give us. So, apologies if some of this is misinformed in my part. But it seems to me that you've looked at facts and figures. You've done an audit rather than looking for reasons for some of these patterns, and you're trying to address at the top level, the most visible level, the Olympic Games, some of the inequalities and inequities. I'm just wondering if you want to say something, if you could say something about what may be a tension, and maybe may not be, but maybe a tension between being seen to address the top end of the Olympic Games without looking at reasons or rationale for the inequalities, but fixing it. And I'm wondering if there's a tension between fixing the public face of sport from the top end and whether there's a tension there between the grassroots and the causes and the underlying reasons why there's inequality in the first place. If that's in danger, actually, if the Olympics does equalise out males and females, is there a danger in some respects that actually hidden power relations underneath at grassroots level may actually be overlooked or maybe ignored or may not even be visible to people because there's this, on the surface, the Olympic Games is equal and we've solved the problem? I just wondered if there was maybe a tension there.
No, and you're exactly right, and we've thought long and hard about this. More than anything, the IOC sets it up as the moral authority for sport, and to go to the most public face of sport was partly a convenience because of the availability of data, but also because this is the aspirational route for athletes in any Olympic sport, is that's where I'm going, and national sports organizations and the international federations will only get in line if there are places for women. They're gonna have much more sport development for women if they know that there are Olympic opportunities in that sport or for those women, and so it's strategic. I understand a number of the other issues. There's a lot of hidden stuff I want to just mention on the blog post that Grant has just put up. We're keeping our minds open to looking at some other more hidden inequalities that happen even at this level of sport. And one is ticket distribution for friends and family. And we found out that at Sochi, women ice hockey players were limited to 2 tickets, and the men ice hockey players who were professionals had unlimited access to tickets for friends and family. So that's kind of one of those little things, that is a difference. The London Olympics, the Japanese men's soccer team flew first class from Japan, and the world champion women's soccer team flew in the back of the plane. And it was similar with basketball, where the Australian women's basketball team is much better than the men's basketball teams in terms of achievement. The men's basketball team from Australia flew first class, and then the women's basketball team flew in the back of the plane. So, those kind of hidden inequalities that we're thinking about, and the blog puts out a call. If you know of any of these kinds of things, that we can start together. Yeah, it's a balance. That tension is a real balance, and I think it depends on the country. It depends on the equity policies in place. But I think if there are Olympic places for women in a sport, that will filter down to developmental opportunities for women. And that was our thinking in this, but we're by no means not aware of the less publicized levels of sport.
I've got a specific and a general question, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in the quotas that you put up.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered whether you could just expand a little bit more. I wondered whether the quotas that were set were about a qualification standard, or if they were quotas in terms of the numbers of men and women that could qualify, if that makes sense.
No, they are qualification standard it's established by the Olympics, but it's also re-established by the National Olympic Committee in each country, and in order to achieve representation, the IOC will waive its quota standards. So the Saudi judoka who was in London was the only woman there without a black belt. But a place was made for her in order to achieve that representation. The quotas are, and I think that there's a kind of a historical question here that's interesting. It's almost impossible to find where they come from, and I think we would have to go through International Federation minutes for years. International federations are not the most transparent organizations, and where we would actually find those data. But my sense is that there's a boys' club of International Federation and Olympic officials who bargains and negotiates for quotas based on this artificial 10,500 athlete cap, or whatever the cap is for the sport, and and they decide we can't possibly cut men's wrestling, even though we threaten to, we can't possibly cut it, and so women's wrestling we need to keep smaller, and that kind of thing. So my sense is that it's really backroom negotiations that happen around that, and all the IOC is really concerned about is the 10,500 athlete cap that they've imposed on this, and then everybody gets to work within their international federation limits, and women are clearly the losers in this. And in many sports, track and field and swimming are they don't impose a gendered quota. They just say 2,000 track and field athletes, 1,500 swimmers, and the countries will sort those out in whatever way they do. And because the number of events are nearly equal in both of those sports, they are equal in swimming. When you do the actual head count, swimming and track and field are quite close, but there are always more men than women. We haven't found any situation where even where there, and then equestrian is the only open event still remains. Sailing and shooting used to be open events as well, and then they gendered within the last 25 years, I think. So equestrian is still the only open event, and equestrian, again, we didn't do the gender of the horses, but there's always more men than women in the equestrian events as well. So, yeah, that just seems to be the way it falls out. But certainly it's a PhD thesis for actually figuring the history of quotas and how they've changed, and it would take some really good fly-in-the-wall field work to get into those negotiations that I'm speculating about, but I'm sure that they are happening.
Is it okay to ask a more question? Craig? High-performance sport, there's so many examples of how women have literally kind of broken down barriers and exceeded expectations.
Yeah.
And it also seems like a wonderful analogy for society more generally. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on what messages come out of the process that you've gone through in terms of this analysis and this work for society more generally.
The most provocative discussions that we have around this, and we have it in classes, we have it over beers, over coffee, is the removal of gender segregation in sports. And I think where everywhere else, all of those other barriers have been broken down except in sports. And probably the biggest message is that it's really difficult to be separate but equal. Racial laws in the United States discovered that, so separate but equal is probably the biggest problem, given the difficulty of degendering sports in this way. I think sports could probably become the first place where you could move towards separate but equal and justify the segregation. But there's a lot of work, and I think we said in the first report, I think that some of that work will not happen until the International Federation boards and the IOC itself move to much more equity in their leadership, and their representation on those boards, and then the doors may be more easy to open. So it's kind of leadership, but the desegregating sport is next time you're having a couple of beers, have that discussion, because it goes on and on and on. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah.
Gavin, Sam, at the beginning, Grant described you as an activist. I just wondered how you use this as setup to try and make change. I think as we went beyond sport people, we talked to sport people, who do you start building links to try and make a change?
My activism is, I see myself as a public sociologist. I try not to, but these all have a Creative Commons copyright, they're freely available to use for anybody, and I try to distribute work in that way. my activism is primarily in the classroom, where I try and radicalize students on a routine basis. And it's also through negotiations with sport organizations like Sport Canada, a small contract I have with the Commonwealth Foundation now, those kinds of things. And by probably another way is by being accessible to media on a routine basis. And the more important the issue is, if somebody wants to ask me about fan behavior at the Toronto Maple Leafs, I'm less likely to take that call. But if somebody wants to ask me about child abuse or an equity issue or something like that, I will always take those calls and do the TV, radio, whatever, and fight those battles. So it's in that sense, it's a part of what Bruce Kidd calls the long march through the corridors. Apartheid, the sport contribution to the end of apartheid was through the long march through the corridors of the international organizations, grabbing somebody and talking to them, being on committees, all of those kinds of things. So, and change is slow, change is hard work, but it's, this is a small contribution to it, I think. So it's,
I was interested in the gigantism.
Yeah.
The overdoubling of the other accredited people.
Mm-hmm.
Was that because of the huge increase in volunteers, and was it due to the huge increase in security in the last 12 or 15 years?
I'm not sure. No, most of the security is not accredited. I think it takes place at borders and those places. So, but I mean, there is more security within stadium. Yeah, yeah. My sense is that a significant part of it, and I think Jean-Louis Chapelet has got a better breakdown than I have of this. It's been among sponsors and their families. Particularly those mega sponsors for the Olympics, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and the executives and the families and the advertising people and whoever, and the Olympic family itself, where the IOC members' families, the NOCs and their families, judges and referees, all of those other individuals that are coming in, and sports scientists. Yeah, some may be credentialed, some may not be. So it's it's. I mean, they have let it just expand unreasonably, and you can see that it's become a club. Quote Bruce Kidd again, he used to call them badges, all of the Olympic officials, had badges on their blazers, they were the badges. And it used to be just those people, that's 1930s, 1950s, but now there's this huge commercial endeavor, mega event with all the media and everything. And but it is astonishing. In 12 years, it went from less than 200,000 to over 500,000. It is astonishing.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Good presentation or good lecture rather. I was wondering if you also consider the way the media treat female and male athletes, especially the commercial campaign associated with the Olympic Games. If you look at the top sponsors commercial campaign associated with Olympic Games, they often show that female, they present as a sexy woman, whereas a male as a pro athlete. So how do you consider that as an issue?
Yeah, it's outside of this work. It's, we have done some work in that area, but in fact, I think we list 5 areas where there is significant gender inequality. One is sex testing and the return of sex testing. One is media representation. One is the kind of things I was talking about today. One is leadership and coaching. And I think there's a 5th one as well. But, you know, so the media representation is a real key piece. And all of these areas of inequality interlink and overlap. You know, I'm sure the media representation feeds into the rule differences, you know, and vice versa there, you know, in the gendering of them, and certainly looking at the intersection of those various forms of inequality is going to be a really important thing in the future. But I think there is a connection, but they've certainly been treated differently in terms of for purposes of research, but a meta-analysis that brought the 4 or 5 areas together would be, I think, really an important thing to do. Yeah. So I don't want to. I mean, you know, the media gendering is obvious, and probably the best work that we did on that suggests that, you know, when I asked students which is going to be the easiest to change, the amount of media coverage or the form of that media coverage, and most of them think that the amount of media coverage is probably the easiest thing to change. And I use a theoretical argument to suggest that, and a theoretical and data-based argument to suggest that with appropriate training, you can change the culture of the way women's sports are represented. And the example I use is the Sydney Olympics, where we were actually on the ground doing research there, and one of our alumni was head of CBC Sports, a swimmer, a woman swimmer, and she had insisted on media training for the CBC camera crews and production crews, and gender equity media training. And the work that we did showed that the coverage was pretty much identical, and we focused particularly on diving and the actual shot sequence, you know, of face-on, profile, camera framing. Everything was identical for men and women. The number of replays of the dive was exactly the same. The rules of competition were slightly different. Men do more dives, you know, in the final round than women, but everything was identical. Except the commentary, and that was the last, you know, where a mistake by a woman diver was much more often attributed by both men and women commentators to nerves, and mistakes by male divers were just attributed as mistakes, you know. And so that was and a couple of slips. They had been trained to call divers by their, or athletes by their full names or by their last names, and a couple of times they called women divers by their first name, and never male diver. So that was the difference. Then in Athens, 4 years later, BBC was going through a financial crisis, and the technology had meant that they could do much of their production remotely, so they didn't have people on the ground there. They didn't have the same media training because Nancy Lee had moved on from head of CBC Sports. And one of my students did same shot-by-shot analysis of beach volleyball, and for the serve, the male competition, the service was always from the center court camera looking down at the server, and for the women's service it was always from a low angle camera behind her, and you know, it was a real gendering of production values that had happened again. So think the evidence is that you can train the culture, you can insist on it, you can shame and name and parody and do all kinds of things, and they will react. The media will react to this if we have enough campaign. But the economics of sports production are such that nobody's going to give equal time to women's sports they give to Premier League or to NFL football or that kind of thing, you know, because the economics just don't make sense. So, you know, and so long as the media is capitalist media, you know, it's going to be driven by that. So, but I think you can change some things. Yeah.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
Floor's all yours.
Okay.
All yours.
What also find interesting is that the commercial campaign of the top sponsors, Olympic sponsors, they're supposed to be help promote the idea of the Olympism. But generally, it is one of the main aim. And when you look at the commercial campaign, they all highlight, say, for example, the P&G is one of the sponsors of the Olympic Game. If you look at their campaign, they show that the Victoria Pendleton as a beautiful woman, where Chris Hoy is a professional cyclist. So I think there's a contradiction between the role of sponsor and the activity they're supposed to do, and what they do in real campaign is they are go in opposite direction forward to the Olympism or idea of the Olympic Games. I think it's to me very interesting finding.
It is, and I would extend that to if the IOC was really the moral authority. They would pay attention to the top sponsors' advertising campaigns. They'd pay attention to their manufacturing processes, you know, for fair labor. You know, if you want to be a moral authority, you need to step up, you know, and not just hold your nose and go with the company that's prepared to give you the most money. And they could make a virtue of it by going with some serious corporate social responsibility corporations for their top sponsors. And I think they would be applauded for it. And they could win a lot of ground, but it doesn't seem to be on their agenda so far. Yeah.